The Virginia woods stretched out before Sarah like an endless sea of green, the afternoon sun filtering through the thick canopy above. It was late August, and the air hung heavy with humidity, the kind that clung to your skin and made every breath feel like an effort. Sarah had been hiking for hours, venturing off the beaten path into the more secluded areas of the forest. She had wanted to escape the crowded trails and find a little solitude, a break from the constant noise of her life back in Richmond. The further she went, the quieter it became. The chirping of birds, the rustling of the leaves, everything seemed to soften as she ventured deeper into the woods. It was the kind of stillness that was peaceful at first, but then became unsettling the longer you stayed in it. Sarah hadn't expected to feel this lost, though. She was an experienced hiker, but this forest was different. The trees felt too close together, the path more winding and difficult to follow. The dense undergrowth rose higher here, its twisted vines wrapping around her ankles as though trying to slow her down. Wiping the sweat from her brow, Sarah paused to catch her breath. Her water bottle was nearly empty, and she silently cursed herself for not bringing a backup. She hadn't anticipated the heat would drain her energy so quickly, nor had she planned to be this far off the trail. As she rested, a strange sensation settled over her. It was subtle at first, a prickling along the back of her neck, as if someone, or something, was watching her from the shadows. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the woods behind her. Nothing, just the trees standing silently, their dark trunks and thick branches swaying slightly in the breeze. "You're just tired," she muttered to herself, trying to shake off the feeling. But the quiet persisted, growing heavier, more oppressive, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. It was then she heard it, the faint sound of water trickling nearby. Her parched throat tightened at the sound, a welcome reprieve from the heat that clung to her like a second skin. The thought of finding a natural spring or a creek to refill her water bottle brought a sense of relief, and she pushed through the thick brush, moving toward the sound. The brook appeared before her, seemingly out of nowhere. It was a narrow stream winding its way between moss-covered rocks and the gnarled roots of towering trees. The water was crystal clear, bubbling gently as it made its way downstream. There was something about it that felt untouched, almost too perfect in the middle of this wild, forgotten forest. The kind of beauty that looked as though it had been preserved for centuries, hidden away from the rest of the world. Kneeling at the edge of the brook, Sarah dipped her hand into the water, letting the cold liquid wash over her fingers. It was so refreshing, so pure. She hesitated for only a moment, glancing around the still woods before bringing her cupped hands to her lips and drinking deeply. The water slid down her throat like ice, instantly cooling her from the inside out. She let out a long breath and smiled to herself. It was exactly what she needed. As she stood up, wiping her wet hands on her pants, a strange unease began to creep in. The forest around her seemed darker somehow. The late afternoon sun, which had been filtering softly through the trees, now felt dimmed, as if clouds had gathered overhead, casting the woods in shadow. The air felt thicker, almost suffocating, and the quiet returned, heavier this time. Sarah's smile faded. Something was wrong. She glanced around, trying to find the trail she had come from, but the woods had changed. The once familiar undergrowth now looked like an impenetrable wall of green and shadow. The trees seemed taller, their branches weaving together overhead, blocking out the sky. A cold shiver ran down her spine. It felt like the forest was watching her, waiting for her to make a move. Suddenly, the sound of the brook felt louder, more insistent. The gentle bubbling was now a rush, a roaring in her ears, as if the brook had swelled, its current more powerful than before. She took a step back, her heart racing, her skin prickling with unease. "I need to get back," she whispered, glancing around for any sign of the trail. But the woods had swallowed it. Panic began to rise in her chest. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "You're just tired. It's fine. You'll find the trail again." But the more she tried to reassure herself, the more the oppressive atmosphere weighed down on her. The sunlight, now barely penetrating the canopy above, cast long, dark shadows across the forest floor. The silence was no longer peaceful. It felt like a warning. Sarah turned and began to walk, faster this time, pushing through the underbrush in the direction she thought she had come. But with every step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The shadows seemed to move at the corner of her vision, flickering between the trees. Though when she turned, there was nothing there. Just empty woods. A part of her wanted to run, to break into a full sprint and leave the brook and whatever strange energy lingered there behind. But she forced herself to keep a steady pace, her breath quickening as her pulse raced. The sound of her footsteps felt too loud in the heavy silence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she found a familiar marker, a large oak tree with its bark split open from a lightning strike. Relief flooded through her as she hurried past it, her footsteps quicker now. She was almost back, but the unease still clung to her, trailing her all the way to the edge of the woods, where her small, rented cabin stood at the edge of the tree line. She threw open the door and stepped inside, slamming it behind her. Safe, or so she thought. As the night wore on, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't left the forest behind. It had followed her, creeping into her cabin, lingering in the corners of the room where the shadows were deepest. That night, as she lay in bed, the sounds of the brook still whispered in her ears, faint but insistent. And then she saw her, standing in the corner of the room, cloaked in black, her face hidden in shadow. The woman stood silently, her presence as heavy as the air in the forest. Sarah blinked, her breath catching in her throat. She tried to move, to scream, but her body was paralyzed, frozen with fear. The woman's voice was a low rasp, chanting something ancient, a language Sarah didn't recognize. The words wrapped around her, pulling her deeper into the darkness. And then, just as suddenly, the woman was gone. Sarah sat up, gasping for air, her body drenched in sweat. The room was still, too still, as though the night itself had been holding its breath. She glanced around, but there was no sign of the woman, no trace of what she had seen. But the unease remained, like a cold hand on her shoulder. Outside, the brook continued its ceaseless whispering, a reminder that something had changed, something had followed her home. The days after Sarah's encounter with the woman in black passed in a strange, dreamlike blur. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the boundary between the waking world and her dreams had grown thin, fragile. The dreams that followed were vivid, too vivid, pulling her deeper into a place that felt ancient and dark, filled with whispers and shadowed figures. Every night, the woman appeared at the edge of her bed, her voice a low hum, repeating the same chant in the same unknowable language. At first, Sarah convinced herself it was stress. The isolation of the woods, her exhausting hike, the discomfort of being alone in an unfamiliar place. Her mind was playing tricks on her, nothing more. But deep down, she knew it was something far more sinister. She could feel it in her bones, in the way the air in her cabin grew colder at night, the shadows lengthening, closing in around her. The dreams didn't stop. They only became more frequent, more intense. The woman in black beckoned to her, closer each time. Her hand, once still at her side, now reached towards Sarah, as if commanding her to follow, to return to the brook. Every night, the pull of the woman's voice grew stronger, winding itself around Sarah like invisible chains, dragging her closer to the water's edge. During the day, Sarah tried to ignore it, but the signs of her nightly wanderings were impossible to dismiss. She began waking up with dirt under her fingernails and mud smeared on the soles of her feet. Her bed, once pristine, was often caked with grime, as though she had been walking barefoot through the woods in her sleep. She couldn't remember how or why she had left the cabin. But each morning, the evidence was there, undeniable. She tried to brush it off, but the sense of unease was always present, lingering in the back of her mind like a warning she couldn't fully understand. Her friends, concerned by her distant behavior, began to check in more often, but their words barely registered with her. It was hard to focus on anything they said when the woman's voice was always whispering in the background, a steady hum that followed her throughout the day. It was as though the brook itself had found a way inside her mind, rooting itself there like some parasitic presence she couldn't dislodge. "You seem off lately," her friend Rebecca had said one afternoon as they sat on the porch of Sarah's cabin. The sun was high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the woods, but to Sarah, the light felt too harsh, too foreign. "Are you sure you're okay? Maybe you've been out here alone for too long." Sarah had nodded absently, her gaze drifting toward the tree line where she swore she could see the faint outline of the woman standing just beyond the reach of the sunlight. She blinked and the figure was gone. "I'm fine," she lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired. Haven't been sleeping well." Rebecca had frowned but let it go, turning the conversation to lighter topics. Sarah had tried to engage, but her thoughts kept slipping, her attention divided between the present and that constant pull, that unrelenting whisper calling her back to the brook. That night, the dreams came again, but this time they were different. The woman's chanting was louder, her figure clearer, more defined. She was no longer standing at the edge of Sarah's bed. She was beside her, her breath cold against Sarah's skin, her dark eyes burning with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. The words she spoke seemed to vibrate in the air, reverberating inside Sarah's skull until they were the only thing she could hear. Sarah tried to wake up, to shake off the nightmare, but she couldn't move. Her limbs were frozen, pinned down by some unseen force. All she could do was lie there, her heart hammering in her chest as the woman's face hovered inches from her own, her lips moving in that relentless chant. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the dream shifted. Sarah was no longer in her bed. She was standing in the woods, barefoot, the cold earth beneath her feet slick with mud. The trees towered around her, their branches creaking and groaning like old bones. The air was thick with fog, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the soft murmur of the brook. The woman was there, standing in the middle of the stream, her black dress floating on the surface of the water, as though she were weightless. Her eyes met Sarah's, and for a moment they seemed to flicker with something, anger or perhaps triumph. Sarah couldn't be sure. "Come," the woman whispered, her voice echoing through the trees. "Come back." Before she could stop herself, Sarah took a step forward, her feet sinking into the soft earth as though the forest floor were trying to pull her down. The woman's voice grew louder, more insistent. "Come back to the water. Come back to me." Sarah's heart raced as she moved closer, her body acting on its own, as though something deep inside her had surrendered to the pull of the brook. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to turn around, to run, but her body refused to listen. She was almost to the edge of the brook when she woke with a start, her body jerking upright in bed. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. For a moment, she couldn't tell if she was still dreaming or if she had finally woken up. Her room was dark, the shadows deep and unmoving, but the whisper of the brook still echoed in her ears, the woman's voice lingering at the edge of her consciousness. Sarah threw back the covers and climbed out of bed, her feet hitting the cold wooden floor with a soft thud. She walked to the window and peered out into the woods, her eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. And then she saw it. There, at the edge of the forest, just beyond the reach of the moonlight, stood the woman. Her figure was barely visible, a silhouette against the dark trees, but Sarah knew it was her. The woman in black. She was watching, waiting, her presence a silent command. "Come." The whisper echoed in Sarah's mind, though the woman's lips didn't move. Sarah's heart raced as she tore herself away from the window, her hands shaking as she stumbled back to bed. She pulled the covers up to her chin and squeezed her eyes shut, willing the nightmare to end, willing the woman to leave her alone. But the pull of the brook was stronger now, a constant, unrelenting force tugging at her soul, dragging her closer to the water's edge. Every night the dreams grew more intense, more violent, until Sarah was no longer sure where the dreams ended and reality began. She began waking up in strange places, outside her cabin, her feet muddy, her clothes damp with morning dew. She couldn't remember how she had gotten there, but each time the feeling of the brook's pull was stronger, more urgent. The woman wanted her to return to the water, and Sarah was losing the will to fight. The sun was setting as Sarah sat on the porch of her cabin, watching the last slivers of daylight disappear behind the Virginia woods. The air was cooler now, the oppressive humidity of summer lifting slightly. But even as the night brought relief, Sarah felt no comfort. The forest around her seemed darker, denser, as though the trees had drawn closer in the days since her last dream. Or maybe it wasn't a dream. Maybe none of this was a dream anymore. It was hard to tell where reality ended and the nightmares began. She hadn't slept through the night in weeks. Every time she closed her eyes, the woman in black was there, waiting. The chanting never stopped now. The woman's voice filled Sarah's mind, even during the day, her words curling around her thoughts like tendrils, squeezing out anything else. Sarah tried to hold on to her sense of self, to remind herself that this wasn't real, that she wasn't losing her mind. But that was a lie. She could feel the cracks forming, could sense her own descent into madness. And the worst part, a part of her no longer cared. The fight had worn her down to the bone. She was exhausted, mentally and physically drained. Each night she awoke with her feet covered in mud, her hands caked with dirt, no memory of how she'd gotten out of bed or where she had gone. The brook was calling her, and she could no longer resist its pull. The dreams had changed too. They weren't just dreams of the woman standing at her bedside, beckoning her. Now, the dreams dragged her into the water itself. She could feel the icy current pulling her down, her lungs burning as she struggled for air. Each time the water filled her mouth, her throat, until she awoke gasping for breath, soaked in sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs. It felt real. Too real. During the day, Sarah tried to distract herself with mundane tasks, but nothing worked. The woman's voice was always there, whispering just beneath her thoughts. Sometimes Sarah would catch a glimpse of her in the corner of her eye, a flash of black fabric, a shadow moving just beyond her vision. But when she turned, the figure was gone, leaving behind only a suffocating sense of dread. Her friends had grown more concerned, but there was nothing they could do. They didn't understand. How could they? They couldn't see the woman. They couldn't hear the brook's whispers, couldn't feel the pull of the water, the cold touch of the spirit that was slowly taking control of Sarah's life. She had stopped answering her phone, had stopped responding to their messages. They would ask too many questions, and Sarah didn't have the answers. All she knew was that she was being drawn to the brook, whether she wanted to go or not. One afternoon, after a particularly vivid dream where the woman's icy hand had grazed Sarah's skin, leaving a burning cold mark on her arm, she'd tried to leave. She had packed a bag, thrown her hiking gear into the car, and driven toward town with the intention of getting as far away from the forest as possible. But something stopped her. The further she drove from the brook, the more the pain in her chest grew, a gnawing, hollow ache that spread like poison through her veins. She tried to ignore it, but by the time she reached the edge of town, the pain had become unbearable. She pulled over on the side of the road, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the sensation consumed her, as though the forest itself was reaching into her chest, squeezing her heart, dragging her back. tears stung her eyes as she gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She had never felt such agony, such an intense, all-consuming need to return to the brook. It was as though her soul had been tethered to it, bound to the water in a way she couldn't sever. She couldn't leave. Sarah had turned the car around without a second thought, driving back to the woods, to her cabin, to the cursed brook. As soon as she stepped out of the car, the pain had vanished, replaced by a sickening sense of relief, like a prisoner who had resigned themselves to their chains. She was trapped. There was no escaping the brook, no escaping the woman in black. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, the dreams came again, darker and more vivid than before. She was standing in the middle of the woods, the trees twisted and gnarled, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. The brook was there, the water black and shimmering in the moonlight. The woman stood at its edge, her eyes glowing faintly as she extended her hand towards Sarah. This time, Sarah didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her feet sinking into the cold, wet earth, her breath shallow as she neared the water. The brook's surface rippled as though anticipating her arrival, as though it knew she was coming home. The woman's voice filled the air, louder now, more commanding. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. She was being called to the water, summoned to join the woman, to let the brook take her. She felt the pull deep inside her, a magnetic force she couldn't resist. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped closer to the water, her body trembling with fear and anticipation. The air around her grew colder, the wind picking up, rustling through the trees as the brook's current grew stronger, its murmur turning into a roar. The woman in black smiled. It was the first time Sarah had seen her face clearly. Her features were sharp, almost beautiful, but her eyes were hollow, empty, like deep wells that led to nothingness. "Come," the woman whispered, her voice echoing through the trees. "It is time." Sarah's foot hovered over the water's edge, the cold mist rising from the brook, wrapping around her legs like a shroud. Every instinct in her screamed to run, to turn back, to fight. But she couldn't. She was too tired, too weak. The pull was too strong. Suddenly, the ground beneath her gave way, and she was falling into the water, into the black, icy depths of the brook. The cold engulfed her, shocking her senses as the water closed over her head. She thrashed wildly, her arms and legs flailing as she struggled to swim, to find the surface, but there was no up, no down, only the endless, dark water pulling her deeper. The woman's voice surrounded her, wrapping around her like a cloak, soothing, commanding. "Let go," she whispered. "Let the water take you." And for the first time, Sarah wanted to. She wanted to let go, to sink into the darkness, to let the brook have her. The fight drained out of her, her body growing still as the current carried her down. But just as she was about to surrender, something snapped inside her, a tiny flicker of resistance, of life. Her hands clawed at the water, her legs kicked harder, and somehow, through the haze of freezing blackness, she found the strength to push herself upward. She broke the surface, gasping for air, her body shivering uncontrollably as she clawed her way back to the shore. Her lungs burned, her limbs heavy with exhaustion, but she was alive. Somehow she had escaped the brook's grasp. For now, Sarah collapsed on the ground, the wet earth cold beneath her, her body trembling with both fear and relief. But as she lay there, staring up at the darkened sky, she knew this was far from over. The brook had let her go this time, but the woman in black would come for her again. She could feel it. The pull of the water was still there, deep inside her, tugging at her soul. And next time, she wouldn't be able to fight it. The night was unnervingly still as Sarah stood at the edge of the brook, her reflection rippling in the dark water beneath her. The air was colder than it had been, a biting chill that seeped into her bones, but she no longer shivered. The cold no longer mattered. Nothing did. The forest around her, once alive with the hum of insects and the rustle of leaves, had fallen silent, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for what was about to happen. She had lost count of the days, the hours, the moments. Time had become meaningless, slipping through her fingers like the water from the brook. The pull had been relentless, an ever-present force dragging her back, drawing her deeper into the darkness. Sarah had tried to resist, had tried to hold on to herself, but each step, each breath had only led her back here, to the place where it all began. The brook's surface was unnaturally still, the water so dark it seemed bottomless, a void reflecting the emptiness she felt inside. She had fought for so long. For what? For some fleeting grasp at sanity. For a life that had already been claimed by something much older, much darker than she could ever comprehend. She wasn't alone. Sarah could feel her, the woman in black, standing just behind her, the familiar presence looming over her like a shadow. But tonight there was no fear. The dread that had once gripped her heart was gone, replaced by a heavy numbness that pressed down on her chest. The fight had drained from her long ago, leaving behind only this inevitable end. Sarah knew she had lost. She had known it for a while, even before she'd returned to the brook. It was in the way the dreams had consumed her, how her waking hours had become a blur of whispers and shadows. The woman's voice had grown louder, more commanding, until it had become indistinguishable from her own thoughts. There was no difference between day and night now, no separation between the world she once knew and the world the brook had created for her. "Come," the voice whispered, softer this time, a final invitation. Sarah exhaled slowly, her breath misting in the cold night air. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She could feel the woman's eyes on her, could sense the cold fingers of the spirit wrapping around her, pulling her forward, inch by inch, toward the water. She stepped closer, the muddy ground soft beneath her feet, and the brook responded. The current, once still, began to move, a slow, steady ripple across the surface, as if the water itself had woken from a deep slumber, ready to claim what was rightfully its own. The pull was stronger now, more insistent, and Sarah no longer had the strength to resist. She didn't want to resist. The brook had taken everything from her mind, her body, her soul. And now, standing at the water's edge, she realized it had also given her something in return. A terrible, unshakable truth. She was never meant to escape. This was always her fate. This place had been waiting for her, calling her long before she had stepped foot in the woods. This was where she belonged. Sarah took one more step, her toes sinking into the freezing water. The shock of it traveled up her legs, but she barely felt it. She was numb, her senses dulled by the inevitability of what was to come. She waded deeper, the water rising to her knees, then to her waist, the cold biting at her skin. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. The woman in black stood just ahead of her now, her figure floating above the surface of the water, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Her face was no longer obscured by shadows. Sarah could see her clearly now, and for the first time she saw herself reflected in the woman's features. They were the same, two sides of the same broken coin. "You're ready," the woman said, her voice no longer a whisper, but clear and cold, a final sentence. Sarah nodded. There was nothing left to say. No more questions, no more doubts. This was what the brook had wanted all along. To take her, to consume her, to make her part of its endless cycle. As the water rose to her chest, Sarah felt her body grow heavier, her movements slower. The current swirled around her legs, tugging her deeper, pulling her under. She didn't fight it, she let it take her. The woman in black smiled, a cold, eerie smile that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine, even now, at the very end. But Sarah didn't look away. She met the woman's gaze, accepting her fate as the water closed over her shoulders. In that moment, she felt it, her soul slipping away, untethered from her body, dissolving into the water like ink spreading through a clear stream. It was peaceful in a way. The pain was gone, the fear, the confusion. There was only the quiet murmur of the brook, the gentle pull of the current. The woman's voice echoed one last time, soft and distant, as Sarah's head dipped beneath the surface. "You are mine now." And then there was only darkness. For a long time there was nothing. No light, no sound, just the cold embrace of the water, wrapping around her, holding her close. But slowly, Sarah became aware of something else, a presence. It was faint at first, just a flicker at the edge of her consciousness, but it grew stronger, more familiar. Another voice, another soul. She could feel them, the others who had come before her. The other women, the other lives that the brook had claimed, bound to this place just as she was now. They were part of her now, their voices mingling with hers, their memories intertwined with her own. She was not alone, and she understood. The brook was never just a place. It was alive. It was ancient. It had been waiting for her, for all of them, to become part of it, to continue the cycle that had begun centuries ago. Sarah's body disappeared beneath the water, carried away by the current, but her soul remained bound to the brook, forever connected to the woman in black, forever waiting for the next traveler to stumble upon the brook, waiting for the next soul to be claimed. And as the water stilled once more, as the forest fell silent again, the brook whispered its eternal promise into the night. The cycle would never end. The brook was always hungry, and it would wait just as it always had,